The shot was an accident. At least, that's what he told himself. Boom! The sound tore through the canyon, a single sharp crack that sent birds scattering into the blood-orange sky. The rifle felt heavy, alien in his hands. A moment ago, it was a tool. Now, it was a judgment. He'd just been checking the chamber, a nervous habit, when his thumb slipped. The bullet didn't care about his intentions. Down by the stream, she fell. Not like a sack of grain, not with a clumsy thud. She went down with a strange, quiet grace, like a dancer finding her final position. One moment she was there, gathering roots, her dark hair a smudge against the setting sun. The next, she was a heap of faded cotton on the dusty bank. His heart, a tough, leathery thing, slammed against his ribs harder than a spooked Mustang hitting a fence. The rifle clattered onto the rocks. He didn't even notice. He ran. His boots, worn from 1,000 miles of nowhere, found purchase on the loose scree. His breath was a ragged fire in his lungs. Every step was a prayer and a curse. Please be alive. Please don't be hurt. What have I done? The thoughts were a chaotic stampede in his head. When he reached her, he saw the blood. A dark flower blooming on the fabric of her skirt, just above the knee. It wasn't a death wound. He knew that much. But it was bad. Real bad. He dropped to his knees, the dust puffing up around him. She was looking right at him. Her eyes were dark, deep as a desert night, and held no fear. Not a flicker. What he saw instead was a cold, hard shock, a stillness that was more terrifying than any scream. He reached for his kerchief, his hands trembling so badly he could barely untie the knot at his neck. I didn't mean to, he stammered. The words were useless pebbles in the vast silence of the canyon. She didn't answer. She didn't spit. She didn't cry. She just watched him, her gaze unwavering, as his clumsy, shaking fingers tried to tie the cloth around her leg. It was an intimate, terrible moment. His hands, stained with her blood, pressing against her skin. A stranger who had just torn her life apart with a careless twitch of his finger. He was a monster. He was a fool. And yet, she let him. He finished the knot, pulling it tight. The bleeding seemed to slow. He looked up at her face, expecting to see hatred, vengeance, something, anything, but there was only that deep, unreadable calm. Her chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. She was weighing him, measuring his soul in the dying light. He opened his mouth to say something else, to apologize again, to offer anything, his horse, his gun, his life. But before he could speak, her lips parted. One word came out, a soft, breathless command. Stay. And that's when he knew this was no accident. Not for her. He stayed. What else could he do? Run? Leave her to the coyotes and the cold? The man he was yesterday might have. The man who rode with rustlers and gambled with crooked cards. But the man kneeling in the dust, with this woman's blood on his hands, couldn't move. That one word, stay, had anchored him. It wasn't a plea. It was a chain. He built a fire with dry mesquite, the flames pushing back the creeping shadows. He kept his gun close, not for her, but for the things that lurked in the dark. The night was alive with sounds, the yip of a distant coyote, the rustle of something in the brush. He sat with his back against a rock, watching her. She hadn't spoken again. He brought her water in his canteen, lifting her head gently. Her hair was like silk against his rough, calloused hands. She drank, her eyes never leaving his. He felt stripped bare under that gaze, every lie he'd ever told, every sin he'd ever committed, laid out for her to see. He washed the wound as best he could, the moonlight turning the water to silver. He was clumsy, his touch too rough, but he was careful, so very careful. He spoke to fill the silence, his voice a low rumble. He told her about the land, about long cattle drives under a sky so big it could swallow a man whole. He talked about dusty towns that all smelled the same: gunpowder, cheap whiskey, and regret. He didn't talk about the man he really was. He didn't mention the bounty on his head. She just listened, her lashes low against her cheeks. Her silence wasn't angry. It was something else, something watchful. He felt like a mouse being observed by a hawk, waiting for the final, inevitable dive. By morning, the kerchief was soaked through with dark, dried blood. But when she opened her eyes, they were clear. The fever hadn't taken hold. Days bled into one another in that small, hidden canyon. It became their world: the sun-baked rocks, the trickling stream, the crackle of the fire. He hunted, bringing back a rabbit, which he skinned and cooked with an uneasy feeling, wondering if he was breaking some rule he didn't understand. She ate it without a word. He started to fear the sound of hoofbeats, the sight of a dust cloud on the horizon. Her people would come looking for her, and when they found him, a white man with a gun, next to their wounded daughter, they wouldn't ask questions. He knew how this story was supposed to end, and yet he didn't leave. He couldn't. Something about her stillness held him there. She started to speak, her voice soft at first. She'd ask for water. She'd point to certain plants, and he would gather them, crushing them between rocks as she instructed with faint gestures. He learned the rhythm of her breathing, the small signs of her pain. Slowly, carefully, words began to grow between them. She told him her name was Ayoka. She spoke of the old songs her grandmother taught her, songs for the rising sun and the falling rain. She told him about her brother, lost in a skirmish with soldiers years ago. Her stories were simple, clean. His were not. He told her half-truths. He was a ranch hand, looking for work. He was passing through. He left out the part about the failed bank robbery, the dead sheriff, the posse that was probably still combing the territory for him. He was ashamed of the man he was, in the face of the woman she was. Her wound healed slowly, knitting itself back together under his clumsy care. But her spirit, that was something else. It was unbreakable. She never once flinched when he came near. She never treated him like the enemy. She just watched him. And sometimes, when he fumbled with the firewood or spilled water, he thought he saw the ghost of a smile on her lips. A strange feeling began to settle in his chest, an unfamiliar ease. It felt dangerous. Then one evening, it happened. The thing he'd been dreading. Voices. They carried on the wind, sharp and suspicious. Men's voices. He shot to his feet, his hand instinctively going to his gun. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. This was it. He had to run, vanish into the shadows like he'd done 100 times before. He turned to go, but her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. The strength in her grip was shocking. It was the grip of a person who was not afraid. It was the grip of a person in control. "Don't," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut through his panic like a knife. "If you run, you die." He stared at her, his heart hammering. Before he could process what she meant, they appeared at the edge of the firelight. Figures with torches, men with faces like carved stone. Her people. They came out of the darkness like spirits, silent and sudden. Their eyes locked onto him, the white man. They saw the rifle leaning against the rock. They saw the blood-stained bandage on Ayoka's leg. Whispers erupted, spreading through the group like a brush fire. A white man's bullet. A crime that could only be answered one way. In the flickering light, he saw the tips of arrows glinting. The circle of warriors tightened around the fire, closing in. There was no escape. He was trapped. He bowed his head, shame and guilt a crushing weight. He waited for her to point a finger, to tell them what he'd done, to condemn him and let the arrows fly. But she didn't. She struggled to her feet, leaning on a stick he'd carved for her. Her body was unsteady, but her voice was as solid as the canyon walls. She began to speak, and what she said made the air freeze in his lungs. She told them the wound was an accident. That was the first lie. She told them he had stayed to care for her, that he had saved her life when he could have easily fled. That was the second. She was shielding him, using her own body, her own honor, as a barrier between him and their vengeance. The fire popped, spitting embers into the night. The circle of warriors held its breath, their dark eyes burning with suspicion and anger. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the raw courage it took to stand before her family, her tribe, and lie for him, for the man who shot her. And in that moment, he understood. She was risking everything. Her reputation, her place among her people, maybe even her life. For him. The question wasn't what she was doing, it was why. The warriors didn't lower their bows. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. The elders, their faces etched with the lines of 100 hard seasons, stepped forward. They spoke in low, guttural tones, their voices like stones grinding together. They spoke of the law, of blood for blood. The tribe's honor had been stained. A debt had to be paid. Ioka stood her ground, her chin high. The old men's eyes were on her, searching for any sign of a lie, any tremor of fear, but her gaze was as steady as a mountain. She had chosen mercy, she told them. But mercy wasn't a gift she could give on her own. It belonged to the tribe. They took them both. 2 warriors took Aoka's arms, helping her walk. 2 more flanked the cowboy, their expressions grim. They led them from the small camp into the heart of their village, a place he hadn't known was so close. The air grew thick with the smoke of many fires and the smell of cooking meat and horses. Faces appeared in the doorways of hide lodges, eyes watching him with a mixture of curiosity and hatred. He was the enemy, the ghost, the walking dead man. They brought him to the center of the village, to a large communal fire where decisions were made, where spirits were said to listen. The entire tribe seemed to materialize from the darkness, forming a silent, watching circle. He was pushed to stand alone, isolated in the firelight. He felt their eyes on him like a physical weight. He didn't look at Ioka. He couldn't. The guilt was a sickness in his gut. He expected no forgiveness. He had lived his life by the gun, and he knew the simple, brutal math of violence. He had seen hatred in all its forms. He was ready for the arrow, the knife, whatever they chose. What surprised him was not their anger. It was his own sudden, shocking clarity. If his death would spare her any more trouble, he would welcome it. She had lied for him. She had put herself in danger for him. He wouldn't let her carry that burden. He wouldn't let her become an outcast because of his mistake. The thought was a solid thing in his chest. Better to die with a shred of dignity than to live and be the cause of her shame. He would confess. He would tell them the truth, that it was his fault, his carelessness, that she was blameless. He squared his shoulders, ready to speak, ready to end it. But her voice cut through the silence first, sharp and clear, as if she had read his mind. "He will not speak of dying," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that startled everyone, including him. "He does not understand." She limped forward into the circle and stood beside him. It was a bold, defiant act. "When he found me," she said, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her people, "he did not see an enemy. He did not see a prize to be taken. He saw a person who was hurt, and he helped." Her words were simple, but they carried the force of a river. That is the truth you must weigh, not the color of his skin or the sound of his gun. A tense murmur went through the crowd. This changed things. An elder with a face like a dried riverbed stepped forward. He was the chief. He pointed a bony finger at the cowboy. "The spirits demand proof. Was this fate, or was it a crime? We must know your heart." Another warrior, young and angry, his face painted for war, shouted, "Let him fight for his life. If he is worthy, he will survive." Ioka flinched at the thought of more violence. The chief raised a hand for silence. He looked at the cowboy, his old eyes piercing. "Will you kneel?" Will you confess your crime and accept the arrow? The cowboy felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, waiting. This was his moment, his chance to tell the truth and set Ioka free. He took a deep breath, but the words that came out were not the ones he expected. He shook his head. No. A gasp went through the crowd. Defiance. I won't kneel to a lie, he said, his voice raw but steady. And I won't fight to prove I'm worthy of a life I almost stole. He looked at Ioka, then back at the chief. I have no defense, only this. When I saw her fall, my first thought was not to run. It was to help. I sat by her side for days. I tended her wound. I prayed for her, and I am not a praying man. He let the silence settle. If you must kill me, I will not run from it. But know this, I carried no malice in my heart, only a fool's carelessness. The fire cracked and spit. His confession hung in the air. It was not the confession they expected. It was not an admission of guilt for being an enemy. It was an admission of his own flawed humanity. Some of the warriors muttered that it was a trick, a white man's clever words. But others were silent, watching, listening. Then Ioka did something that sealed his fate. She stepped forward, right in front of him, and laid her hand on his arm. It was a simple touch, but it was a declaration, a vow. It said, "He is with me. If you harm him, you harm me." The tension in the circle became unbearable. The night deepened, the stars like chips of ice in the black sky. This was the moment of judgment. The young warrior who had called for a fight took a step forward, his hand clenching his knife. He saw this as weakness, an insult to their traditions. The cowboy braced himself. He felt the nearness of death, a cold breath on his neck. But in the center of the fear was a strange calm. It came from her touch, from the solid, unwavering faith she had placed in him. For years he had run from everything, from the law, from himself. But here, in this circle of enemies, under the weight of her trust, he felt steady. If they killed him, he would die steady. If they spared him, he would live every day trying to be worthy of that touch. The chief, who had been watching everything, silent and still, finally moved. He raised a long carved staff and slammed the butt end onto the hard-packed earth. Thump. The sound was final. A judgment delivered. "He will not die tonight," the chief declared, his voice carrying over the crowd. The young warrior froze, his hand falling from his knife. The chief's eyes found the cowboy. "Not because we forgive your carelessness, but because our daughter has shown us a courage that outweighs our anger. She has chosen to see the man, not the enemy." He looked at Ioka, a flicker of pride in his old eyes. Her choice will be the tribe's choice. Relief washed over the cowboy so powerfully his knees almost buckled. He didn't fall. He just stood there, breathing. He looked at Ioka, this woman who had stared death in the face and lied for him. He whispered her name, his voice breaking. For the first time since he'd met her, a true smile touched her lips. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The warriors slowly, reluctantly, lowered their weapons. Their eyes were still hard, still watchful. Trust was not a thing easily given, but the judgment had been made. Ioka took his hand, and together they walked out of the circle of firelight. Her limp was pronounced, and he supported her, his touch now steady and sure. The night air was cool, smelling of sage and wood smoke. He had been spared, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not the end. It was the beginning. His life was no longer his own. It was a debt to her. And as they walked into the darkness, away from the watching eyes, she leaned closer to him. He could feel her breath on his cheek. "My father spared you because of my choice," she whispered, her voice so low no one else could hear. "But he does not know the whole truth." He stopped, turning to look at her in the dim starlight. "What truth?" Her grip on his arm tightened. "The men you ride with," she said, her dark eyes locking onto his. "The ones who call themselves the Clayton Gang. They are the ones who killed my brother." The world tilted on its axis. The relief he'd felt turned to ice in his veins. She knew. She had known all along who he was. Black Creek Jed, the man with $1,000 bounty on his head, the man who rode with killers. This was never about mercy. It was about revenge. His mind reeled. The accident, her command to stay, her defense of him. It was all a lie, a perfectly crafted trap. She hadn't saved him from her people. She had captured him for them. He was a tool, a means to an end. The shame he felt before was nothing compared to the cold, hard fury that now filled him. He'd been played, a fool, twice over. He pulled his arm away from her. "You knew," he said, his voice flat and dead. "This whole time." "I knew," she confirmed, her gaze unwavering. There was no apology in her eyes, only a fierce, burning resolve. "When I saw your face, I recognized you from a drawing I saw in Dusty Rock. The lawmen carry it. They call you Jed. Dusty Rock, the town where they'd hit the bank, the town where Sheriff Miller had died." His stomach twisted. He wasn't just a wanted man. He was a wanted murderer, even though he hadn't pulled that trigger. His old partner, a man named Silas Clayton, had. But it was Jed's face on the poster. "My brother wasn't lost in a skirmish with soldiers," Ayoka continued, her voice trembling with a rage she'd kept hidden for years. "He was trading furs near the Salt River. Your gang wanted his horses. He refused. They shot him in the back and left him for the vultures. We found what was left of him a week later." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her being out there alone, so far from the village, it wasn't to gather roots. She was a scout, a hunter. And he had stumbled right into her sights. The accidental shot had been a gift from the spirits, delivering her prey directly to her. "So what is this?" he snarled, gesturing back towards the village. "This whole show, this trial, what was the point?" "The point," she said, her voice like flint, "is that my people's justice is not the same as your people's. We do not hang a man for the crimes of his partners. We demand a balancing. A debt must be paid in kind." "So you want me dead after all?" "No," she said, and the single word was sharp enough to cut. "I want them dead. Silas Clayton, all of them, and you are going to lead us to them." It was a punch to the gut. She hadn't just saved him to use him as a map. She was turning him into a weapon against the very men he once called brothers, the men who would shoot him on sight. The irony was so bitter, it almost made him laugh. He'd spent the last 6 months running from Silas, trying to disappear. Now, this woman was demanding he run right back towards him. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She didn't have to say it. He could see it in her eyes. Her people had spared him on her word. If he refused to help, that word would be broken. The arrows that had been lowered would be raised again. He had one choice: hunt or be hunted. "You have until sunrise to decide," she said, turning her back on him and limping towards one of the lodges. He was left alone in the darkness, the sounds of the village fading into a dull hum. The cool night air felt like it was suffocating him. He was trapped between two worlds, both of which wanted him dead. On one side, Silas Clayton and his gang of cutthroats. On the other, a tribe of warriors who saw him as a tool for their vengeance, led by a woman whose grief was as sharp and deadly as any knife. He looked up at the cold, distant stars. He had escaped the posse. He had escaped the tribe's justice. But he had not escaped his past. It had found him, here in this canyon, in the form of a woman with eyes as dark as midnight and a heart bent on revenge. He thought about running. His horse was still tied up where he'd left it. He could be gone before the first light touched the canyon rim. He could disappear again, change his name, grow a beard, and melt into the border towns of Mexico. He'd done it before. But as he stood there, the image of Ioka's face swam in his mind. The way she had looked at him when he tended her wound. The flicker of a smile when he'd been clumsy. Was it all an act? Every moment? Every shared silence? He had felt something real growing between them in that small canyon. A fragile, tentative trust. Or had he just been a fool, seeing what he wanted to see? He walked to the edge of the village, looking out into the vast, empty desert. Running felt like the smart thing to do, the survivor's choice, but it also felt like a coward's choice, and he was tired of being a coward. When the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Aoka emerged from her lodge. She found him sitting by the cold ashes of the main fire, waiting. He looked up at her, his face grim. He had made his decision. "I'll do it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll take you to them." Aoka nodded, a flicker of something, relief, triumph, in her eyes. She had won. She had her weapon. But then he added a condition, one she had not expected. "But we do it my way," he said, standing up to face her. "Your warriors are good fighters in this land. But Clayton's world, it's different. It's treacherous, full of lies and ambushes. If we go in with arrows and war cries, we'll all be dead before noon. You want revenge? You have to learn to be a ghost, a whisper, like them." She stared at him, surprised by his sudden authority. This was not the broken, guilty man from the night before. This was Black Creek Jed, and he was taking control. A council was held. The warriors were not pleased. They were proud men, accustomed to their own ways of fighting. To be told by a white outlaw that their methods were useless was a deep insult. The same young warrior who had wanted to fight Jed now argued fiercely against his plan. His name was Coda, and his hatred for Jed was a palpable thing. "He is a snake," Coda argued, his voice ringing through the council. "He will lead us into a trap. He will betray us to his friends." But Aoka stood by Jed's side. "My brother died because we did not understand the enemy," she said, her voice silencing the protests. "This man, he understands them. We will listen. We will learn. Or my brother's spirit will never find peace." Her words, and the chief's reluctant agreement, carried the day. Jed was to lead a small war party. 5 of their best warriors, including a skeptical and hostile Coda. Aoka insisted on going with them. Her leg was still weak, but her will was iron. She would see this through to the end. The days that followed were tense. Jed began to train the warriors in his methods. He taught them how to move silently through a dusty town, how to read the signs of a trap, how to use the sun and shadows to their advantage. He showed them the weaknesses in the white man's world: greed, pride, overconfidence. Coda resisted him at every turn, challenging his authority, questioning his motives. "You teach us to be cowards," he sneered one afternoon, after Jed had instructed them to retreat from a mock ambush. Jed rounded on him, his eyes cold as steel. "I teach you to be alive," he bit back. "A dead warrior can't get revenge. You want to charge in and die with honor? Fine. But you'll die alone. I'm here to win." Slowly, grudgingly, the warriors began to respect his knowledge. They saw the logic in his tactics. He was teaching them a new kind of war. As they prepared, a strange bond formed between Jed and Aoka. The deception that had brought them together was now a shared secret, a foundation of their new purpose. He found himself watching her, admiring her strength, her unbending will. She, in turn, began to see past the outlaw and glimpse the man underneath, the man who had stayed, the man who was now risking his life to help her. The line between captor and captive, between tool and partner, began to blur. One night, as they sat by a small fire cleaning their weapons, she asked him a question that had been hanging between them. "Why did you ride with a man like Silas Clayton?" Jed was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "When you've got nothing," he said finally, his voice low. And no one. The first hand that's offered looks like a friendly one. He took me in when I was just a kid, taught me how to shoot, how to survive. I thought he was my friend, my family. What changed? I did, he said. Or maybe I just finally opened my eyes. There's a difference between surviving and preying on the weak. I saw the cruelty in him, the pleasure he took in other people's pain. The day he shot Sheriff Miller. Miller was a good man. He had a family. Silas laughed. He laughed as the man died. That's when I knew I had to get out. So I ran. He looked at her, his eyes full of a pain she was beginning to understand. I've been running ever since. In that moment, she saw the truth. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake and had been trying to outrun it. Her quest for revenge had been simple, black and white. Kill the men who killed her brother. But now, with Jed sitting across from her, the world felt gray. The day came when they were ready. They rode out from the village, a small, strange company. A white outlaw, a wounded woman, and 5 warriors, leaving their familiar world of rock and sage for the dusty, violent towns of men. Their target was a town called Redemption, a cruel joke of a name for a place that was little more than a haven for scum, run by a corrupt sheriff who was on Clayton's payroll. It was where Silas and his gang were holed up, spending their ill-gotten gains. Jed's plan was simple and insane. They would not attack the town. They would let the town destroy the gang for them. They arrived on the outskirts at dusk, hiding their horses in a rocky arroyo. Jed, Aoka, and Koda, disguised in dusty ponchos, would go in alone. The other warriors would wait for their signal. As they walked down the main street, the noise from the saloon washed over them. Laughter, shouting, a badly played piano. Jed's body was coiled tight as a spring. This was his old world. He could feel the danger in the air, a familiar, metallic taste. Aoka, despite her limp, walked with a quiet confidence. Her eyes missed nothing, but it was Koda who was most out of his element. He clutched the knife hidden under his poncho, his knuckles white. Every drunk who stumbled past, every hard-eyed gambler, was an enemy. He radiated hostility. "Relax," Jed hissed at him. "You look like you're about to kill someone. You need to look like you belong." Their first stop was the assayer's office. It was closed, a padlock on the door. But Jed knew a thing or two about locks. A few minutes with a piece of wire, and they were inside. The office was dark and smelled of dust and chemicals. "What are we looking for?" Aoka whispered. "Leverage," Jed replied, lighting a small lamp. He went straight to a heavy iron safe in the corner. "The sheriff here, a man named Barlow, he's as crooked as they come. He skims gold from every claim that passes through here, and I know for a fact that Silas knows about it. It's the hold he has over him. But Barlow keeps a secret ledger, a record of his real earnings, just in case he ever needs to run." He began to work on the safe's combination lock, his ear pressed against the cold metal, listening for the faint clicks of the tumblers. It was a skill he hated, a skill Silas had taught him. Aoka and Koda watched in silence. The tension was so thick he could taste it. Finally, with a soft thud, the heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of banknotes, bags of gold dust, and a small leather-bound book. Jed grabbed the book. He flipped it open. Columns of numbers and names filled the pages. This was it, the proof that would ruin Sheriff Barlow. But as he tucked the ledger into his coat, he heard something. Footsteps. Outside the door, heavy boots on the boardwalk, and then a voice that made his blood run cold. Well, look what we have here." The door creaked open, and a silhouette filled the frame. A big man, with a bigger shotgun held casually in the crook of his arm, Sheriff Barlow. And behind him, leaning against the door frame, a cocky smile on his face, was Silas Clayton himself. They had walked right into a trap. Silas Clayton's smile was all teeth. It didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Jedediah," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "I heard you were back in the territory. Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to come right to me." Jed's mind was racing. How? How did they know? He glanced at Barlow, whose fat face was slick with sweat. He looked at Silas, who seemed to be enjoying this immensely. Then his eyes fell on a figure standing in the shadows behind them. A man he didn't recognize, a native scout, his face grim. He must have seen them coming, must have warned Silas. "Looks like you made some new friends," Silas said, his gaze drifting to Ioka and Coda. He looked Ioka up and down, a predatory gleam in his eye. "A pretty one, too." Coda tensed, his hand inching towards his knife. Jed shot him a look. "Not yet." "What do you want, Silas?" Jed asked, his voice steady, betraying none of the panic churning in his gut. "What do I want?" Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I want what you stole from me, Jed. My share from the dusty rock bank. You disappeared with it, you coward." This was the lie Silas had been telling. The lie that had put the bigger bounty on Jed's head. Jed had taken nothing. He had just run. "I didn't take your money," Jed said. "Doesn't matter now," Silas shrugged. "Sheriff here caught you red-handed robbing his safe. A capital offense in the town of Redemption." He grinned. "Looks like you're headed for the gallows, old friend, along with your savage companions." It was a perfect setup. They'd be arrested, tried in a kangaroo court, and hanged by morning. No one would ever know the truth. Ioka's revenge would die with them in this dusty office. But Jed had planned for this. He had hoped he wouldn't have to use it, but he had an ace up his sleeve. "I don't think so, Barlow," Jed said, looking past Silas at the nervous sheriff. He held up the ledger. "Because if we hang, this little book goes to the territorial marshal. I have a friend, waiting on the edge of town. If we're not back by midnight, he rides. I imagine the marshal would be very interested to learn how you've been financing your retirement." Barlow's face went pale. He hadn't counted on this. He looked at Silas, his confidence wavering. Silas's smile faded. He hadn't counted on this either. He had underestimated Jed. He had thought Jed was just a runner, a coward. He hadn't realized Jed had learned to be a planner, a schemer. "You're bluffing," Silas said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Am I?" Jed asked, his voice dangerously soft. "There's one way to find out." He took a step towards the door. "Now here's what's going to happen. We're going to walk out of here. You're going to let us ride away, and you're never going to see this book, or us, again." It was a standoff. The air was thick with unspoken violence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Silas slowly, deliberately raised his shotgun, the twin barrels pointing directly at Jed's chest. "There's a flaw in your plan, Jed," Silas said quietly. "The marshal can't do much if the only evidence, and the only witnesses, are all buried in an unmarked grave." He was going to kill them all, right here, and take his chances. But before Silas could pull the trigger, something happened that no one expected. Aoka, who had been standing silently this whole time, suddenly spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "You are Silas Clayton," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. Silas turned his head slightly, annoyed by the interruption. "That's right, sweetheart. What's it to you?" "You murdered my brother," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, pure hatred. "You shot him in the back on the banks of the Salt River." Silas stared at her for a moment, his brow furrowed, and then a slow smile of recognition spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he chuckled. "The fur trapper. Had a fiery spirit just like you. Yeah, I remember him." He spat on the floorboards. "He should have just given us the horses." That was it. The confession. The final damning proof. And it was the last mistake Silas Clayton would ever make. In that instant, as Silas was distracted by his own arrogance, Coda moved. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a whisper. He was a thunderbolt. With a guttural war cry, he launched himself across the small room, his knife flashing in the lamplight. He ignored the shotgun. He ignored the sheriff. His target was one man. Silas was caught completely by surprise. He tried to bring the shotgun around, but Coda was too fast. The warrior slammed into him, and the knife plunged deep into Silas's side. Silas roared, a sound of rage and pain, and the shotgun went off, the blast tearing a huge hole in the ceiling, filling the room with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Everything exploded into chaos. Sheriff Barlow, panicked, drew his pistol, but Jed was already moving. He threw the heavy ledger like a weapon, hitting Barlow square in the face. The sheriff stumbled back, dazed, his shot going wild. Jed dove forward, tackling him to the ground, his fists flying. Outside, the shotgun blast was the signal. From the rooftops and the alleyways, arrows began to fly. The other warriors, positioned perfectly according to Jed's plan, unleashed a silent, deadly volley into the street. Clayton's men, who had been lounging outside the saloon, were caught completely off guard. They cried out in shock and pain, falling to the dust, arrows sprouting from their chests and backs. Inside the office, Coda and Silas were locked in a death struggle. Silas was bigger and stronger, but Coda was fueled by years of pent-up grief and rage. He twisted the knife, and Silas screamed, a high, unholy sound. Jed, having subdued the sheriff, looked up just in time to see Silas throw Coda off him. Silas was bleeding heavily, but he was still on his feet. He staggered back, reaching for the pistol on his hip. His eyes were wild with pain and hatred. He was going to shoot Coda. But then Ioka stepped forward. In her hand was a small, finely crafted knife she had kept hidden in her boot. Her movements were fluid, precise. She didn't hesitate. She didn't make a sound. She simply closed the distance and drove the blade up under Silas's ribs, straight into his heart. Silas's eyes went wide with shock. He looked down at the knife handle protruding from his chest. He looked at Ioka's face, her expression as hard and unforgiving as stone. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he fell, crashing to the floor like a felled tree. Dead. Silence descended on the small office, broken only by the sounds of shouting and chaos from the street outside. Jed, Coda, and Ioka stood there, breathing heavily, covered in dust and blood. The debt had been paid. But the night was far from over. The fight in the street was short and brutal. Clayton's gang, caught by surprise and without their leader, were no match for the focused, disciplined warriors. The few who weren't hit by the first volley of arrows were quickly cut down. The townspeople, hearing the commotion, wisely stayed indoors. Jed, Ioka, and Coda emerged from the assayer's office into the smoky chaos. The surviving warriors met them in the middle of the street, their faces grim but triumphant. Justice had been done. But Jed knew they couldn't stay. The dead sheriff and a dozen dead outlaws would bring the law down on this town hard. The territorial marshal would be here by week's end, and he wouldn't care about revenge or justice. He'd just see a massacre. "We have to go," Jed said, his voice urgent. "Now." They gathered their horses and melted back into the desert night, leaving the town of Redemption to deal with its dead. They rode hard, not stopping until the sun was high in the sky, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and what they had done. They made a cold camp in a rocky canyon that felt a world away from the violence of the night before. No one spoke much. The reality of what had happened was sinking in. They had won. Ioka had her revenge. Coda had avenged his friend. But there was no celebration, only a quiet, heavy exhaustion. Coda came to Jed as he was tending to the horses. The young warrior's face was no longer filled with suspicion. He looked at Jed, and for the first time, there was respect in his eyes. "You led us well," Coda said, the words coming with some difficulty. "You kept your word. My spirit is at peace." He placed a hand over his heart and gave a short, stiff nod before walking away. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and Jed accepted it as such. Later that evening, Ioka found Jed sitting alone on a ledge, watching the sunset paint the clouds on fire. She sat down beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "It is finished," she said softly. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "It's finished." He looked at her. "What now?" "We go home," she said. He was silent for a moment. "I don't have a home." "You helped my family," she said, looking out at the horizon. "You honored your debt. My father will offer you a place with us, if you want it." It was an offer that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. To live among the people he had been raised to fear, to trade his life of running for a life of community, of belonging. Could he do it? Could he ever truly fit in? "Jed," she said, using his outlaw name, the name he hated. He looked at her. "That man died with Silas Clayton. You can be someone else now." She was offering him more than just a place to stay. She was offering him a chance to be reborn, to shed the skin of his past and start over. It was everything he had ever wanted, but never believed he could have. He looked at her strong profile against the fading light, at the quiet courage in her eyes. He remembered the feel of her hand on his arm in the circle of judgment. He remembered her unwavering resolve in the face of death. The love born of such fire is never simple. It carries the scars of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But in that moment, sitting beside her, he felt a sense of peace he had never known. The hole inside him, the one he had been trying to fill with whiskey and stolen money, felt full. "Okay," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Okay, Ioka." She turned her head and her eyes met his, and this time when she smiled, it wasn't fragile or faint. It was as bright and as sure as the coming dawn. The story doesn't end there, of course. Their life was not easy. There were still those in the tribe who distrusted him. There were still bounty hunters who would comb the territories for the ghost of Black Creek Jed. The world would continue to test them, to try and tear them apart. But they faced it together. Two souls, one born of the open plains and one from the hidden canyons, scarred but unbroken. They had found in each other's defiance a strength that no hardship could shatter. And in the heart of the unforgiving desert, they built a new life, one quiet moment at a time. A life of peace, a life of belonging, a life of love. If you believe that even the most lost souls can find their way home, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we have coming your way are wilder than you can ever imagine.